So, hi, Juliet, welcome. It's a real honour to have the opportunity to speak to you today. For the past few weeks, EcoResolution has been going on a journey of learning and exploration into waste and consumerism and why humans desire these material goods that we just don't need, but that aren't making us happy and that are degrading our communities, our relationships and our quality of life, as well as driving our culture and our societies in a direction inherently at odds with the needs of the natural world. And I'm really excited to speak to you because your work has been behind a lot of our inspiration and our thoughts and the talks that we've been having as a team. So thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
So as well as being an author, you're also a professor of psychology at Boston College and are an expert in the areas of consumption, time use, and environmental sustainability. Now, at first glance, these topics seem quite disconnected. Can you tell me how you've come to focus on these three areas and how they connect with each other?
So my training is as an economist, and my first foray into these issues was through a study of working hours and looking at what was going on in the United States. I wrote a book called The Overworked American, The Unexpected Decline of Leisure, which looked at the fact that rather than getting a leisured society, which is what most people expected would happen as a result of automation, Americans were working increasingly long hours. And I developed a model called the cycle of work and spend, and that led me into the issue of consumption, which also sort of led me towards sociology, which is the field that I'm now in a department of sociology. So studying consumption, then, of course, one of the key things that, one comes to understand as you look at consumption patterns is their ecological unsustainability. So that's how I went from work to consumption to ecology.
And is that your main passion then within consumerism now, is the ecological impacts that it's having?
I do a lot of work on that. I also study the sort of what we might think of as the social factors that propel consumption. So why is it that, as the subtitle of one of my books asked, why we want what we don't need, understanding the pressures that people face for consumer upscaling, how the whole system fits together, to try and understand the sort of possible pathways for reducing ecological impact and the volume of consumption.
And what is it about us humans and why are we desiring kind of more and more material goods despite the very clear impacts that it's having on the environment?
So I think there are a couple of things to understand about consumer consumption expenditures and sort of why we're in the state we're in. The first one is to get out of a framework that sees it as primarily a problem of an individual failing. So, the addiction framework, the idea that we're, coming out of psychology, we're addicted to stuff, or a greed framework, or just, a sort of innate desire framework. All of those are very popular ideas. They're probably the ideas that the average person has been most exposed to, I would say. But for those of us who come from a more sort of social or cultural tradition, so these are sociologists, anthropologists, we look primarily to the ways in which our society is organized. The structures of our society basically are the motive forces for, let's say, upscaling. So a lot of my work has been looking at how people's reference groups, the people that they compare themselves to, the people that they interact with, how those affect our spending, how social inequality is really at the root of the whole consumption system, and how our social position in terms of our class position is really key to the tastes that we have. I mean, this is an idea that the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu is most well known for, but that we are brought up with a sort of a set of tastes and preferences, and also distastes, things that we don't do, which goes along with our social class position. And then there's what I've called competitive consumption, that we just want to keep our position in society. We're not necessarily trying to get ahead of everybody else, but really just keeping up and not falling behind in a world with a growing economy often entails escalating our standard of living.
Yeah. Can we go back a little bit? Because that's really interesting you said that social inequality is at the root of the consumerist culture. Could you unpack that a little bit?
So, yes. So, one of the things I've come to believe from my studies is that when there's more social inequality, people tend to, that dynamic of competitive consumption is more intense. And a lot of it does have to do with that not falling behind. So let's say you're just a typical middle class consumer, or even an upper middle class consumer. And suddenly the people above you who are getting wealthier and wealthier are dramatically upscaling. Well, normally you would be trying to keep some, set distance between yourself and the people above you. And that's how you sort of orient your social place in the world. Maybe you don't have the most expensive car, but you have the one below, or, everybody got you never thought you need an ensuite bathroom, but suddenly, they all have. So there's a lot of that pressure to just keep up with a rising standard of living, and inequality intensifies the fear of falling. And the kinds of inequality we've seen lately are where the people at the top are breaking away from the middle. And so the middle, vast majority of people are feeling a lot more pressure to keep up with that higher group. That's
really interesting. Yeah, just kind of that feeling of needing to keep up with the Joneses type of thing. But also, in my experience, I know that as soon as I start to compare myself or my experience, that always becomes the sort of cause of my sadness or suffering or anxiety. And I think there's a quote that says, comparison is a thief of joy or something. As soon as we start to live in that way, we kind of rob ourselves from any happiness or satisfaction that we can really have in the moment with the things that we already have. I'd love to ask you about how we got here, because most of us today have been raised on the assumption that a consumption-driven economy is inevitable, sensible, and good, and that in fact it's sacred, and that anyone who questions this kind of production-led economy is a heretic or communist or revolutionary. And I find this really bizarre, because it feels like it's so obvious that we can't have this kind of economy, because it's destroying the planet, it's destroying the ecosystems that give us the air we breathe, the land, the land that sustains us, the forests. And how has this kind of sanctity of shopping become a new religion and been so widely accepted?
Well, there are really two sides to it. One has to do with the production side and keeping the production side going. And it's important to understand that the kinds of values that you were just talking about, shopping as a religion, they don't stand on their own. So a lot of the the values that we're living with today were forged in the Great Depression of the 20s and 30s. In Britain, it started in the 20s. In the United States, it was the 30s, and in different countries, different times. But those were 2 decades of depression, and then war, of course, a world war coming afterwards. And there was tremendous fear that the economy would slide back into depression after the war, because it was really only the war that got many of these economies out of the depression. And so the idea of keeping production going and maximizing production was originally thought of more in terms of providing jobs for people. And that's really key, because consumption then becomes a way to provide jobs for people. And you might question consumption and the idea that consumption can make you happy. But certainly the idea that people need employment is one that's much harder to question. So if our consuming is the sort of cure for widespread poverty and unemployment, it comes with a big halo, a golden halo, we could think of it. So that's how it got started in the 1950s and 60s. You had that big push to just keep the economy going. And of course, there since then have been a lot of threats to employment, periodic crises, tremendous technological advance. I mean, we're thinking today about what is artificial intelligence going to do to the number of jobs in the world. And then the global economy vastly expanding the labor pool that the global north countries are competing with. So if you ask the question, how did we get here? That's a big part of it. And then, of course, the message that consumption is the route to happiness took hold and developed a life of its own. But I think it has always had a lot more, it's been a less uniform message, because there's always the counter message that, easier for a rich man to go through the eye of a needle than to get into heaven. And, the population as a whole has an ambivalent relationship to the idea that stuff is what makes you happy.
Yeah, because studies are showing that strong materialistic values have a pervasive undermining of people's well-beings. And but why do you think that is? Because I think it's been linked with, like I said before, the low life satisfaction and depression and anxiety. Do you think that's coming from the kind of competitiveness of it, or what is it about materialistic values that are causing us some suffering?
I do think that. In my own research, I did a study of children and materialism, and I found that the children who were most materially dissatisfied had the highest anxiety and so forth. These are correlational studies, and there's something that's right about them, and yet, on the other hand, I think they also suffer a certain flaw, which is that they fail to recognize that in a society in which social esteem is built around your wealth and your consumption ability, that having more, being able to consume more, is connected with social esteem. And that's very important. I don't think it's just that people are incessantly stupidly kind of on this quest, which is only making them worse and worse off. I mean, how would we explain that when, whole societies for decades are doing something that is just, making them worse off? That kind of defies common sense, because after all, people have the choice to just consume less. Once they're out of poverty, they have the choice to consume less. It fails to recognize the social logic of upscaling and the profound ways in which consumption creates identity. It creates connection with the culture. It creates being part of what the whole society is about. So the organization of our society around consuming gives it a logic that even if it's destroying the planet, or it's not necessarily making us better off, not being able to participate in that when everybody else is will make you even worse off. So it's a more complex relationship among all these variables, I would say.
It's so complex. I'm getting a tangle in my head, actually, when you really realize how deeply embedded this is. Like you said, about our jobs, the way we sustain ourselves, sustain our families, along with our well-being, along with the environment, the economy. It's just so kind of tightly compacted. It's it's a real web, but a really fascinating one as well. I was doing a bit of research about some of your older articles, and I found one called Work Spend, Is This Any Way to Live? And it made me laugh, because over the past year, I've actually kind of like unconsciously said that to cashiers when I'm at like checking out, and they've told me how much it is, and I've just gotten, some money in for work, and then it's just gone in that second, and I've been like, work, spend, just like this kind of weird cycle I'm on. I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about, like the decline, like work hours and the decline of leisure and how that's impacting our communities.
Well, I think it's very problematic. So when people have to work long hours, there are the health effects that they suffer. So more stress, more heart attacks, problems, higher anxiety, and so forth. It affects families, because if working hours are too long, there's not enough time to have good social relations. It affects the ability of people to have friends. If they have to work all the time, it's really hard to keep up friendships. These are the social relationships, need time. Time is a key input into social relationships, and social relationships are at the core of what gives us well-being. And I think this is one of the reasons, that we have all this data that shows, countries getting more and more wealthy, but yet people not getting happier and happier, because in some of those cases, you've got, not all countries, but in some of them, you have either very high or rising working hours associated with that. And then, of course, the other thing is kind of community goods, because people's time and unpaid labor time, whether it's, volunteering or being part of a political process, those things are all really important to community and democracy and civic life. And if people have to work longer and longer hours, our communities suffer because they rely on that time outside of work. They rely on those hours that people put in, the public good dimension of all of those things.
Yeah. So, whereas before we might have within our community had someone who could look after our children when we were at work, we now have to pay for that, which means you need to work longer hours, which means you're away from your kids even more. I often feel that what we're suffering right now in the context of, well-being, spirituality, environment, politics is a crisis of relationship. So, I find that I've never really thought about it from the perspective of consumerism though, and the economy in that way. Also, the other thing is about the political apathy that comes from not enough time to really invest into things like, democracy. You need participation in democracy for it to be a democracy. And I find myself too overwhelmed often to really engage in a really direct way with political campaigns. I'm always doing stuff around the environment, but actually to get involved in like a local, grassroots way from a political perspective, I often feel too busy for. So yeah, I can see that a lot. I'd love to ask you one more question. I know we don't have much time left, but I'd just love to know, like, what kind of shifts, maybe a better way to put it is like, what, if anything, is giving you hope right now? Are you seeing any kind of exciting shifts away from this consumerist culture, or is there anything we can do as individuals within our networks to kind of help inspire these deeper shifts within ideology?
I think there's a lot that's happening, and some of it's post-COVID and some of it is during the COVID period. Certainly there's more and more awareness into the mainstream of certain kinds of more ecologically sustainable goods and services, whether it's, the very large increase in organic foods and health and beauty. So that market has really taken off, and sort of changing food patterns more generally, new distribution patterns, farmers markets, community supported agriculture. I think you call them box schemes in Britain, but so those sorts of things. There's an alternative apparel, sustainable fashion world. I mean, in many areas, the kind of greener ways of consuming are expanding and into the mainstream. And so that's all rather positive. I think for me, the biggest thing is the growth of a now increasingly effective climate movement, particularly the youth climate movement, which is really demanding action. And I would not say that the youth climate movement has yet won, but it has put climate on the agenda in many countries, not all, but in some really key countries in a way that it hasn't been in the past. Certainly in my own country, we had every Democratic presidential candidate basically coming out in favor of a Green New Deal. So although the current administration in the U.S., is about as bad as you could imagine on environmental issues, in fact, worse than you could ever imagine, the reality of what's going on the planet is getting people to move. And the bigger changes in terms of the really big systemic changes are more likely to happen with energy system transformation and the built environment and transport before the sort of voluntary consumer trends really become dominant. So it will be also the incentives coming from the policy changes and the structural changes that I think will really push the consumer side of things. But the fact that let's just call it the alternative or the sustainable consumption movement is there and is growing and is paving the way is going to be really important in the rate of uptake and the rate of change, because it's already forged the path that then will become a much more sort of mainstream or default kind of way to consume, whether we're talking about food or we're talking about electric vehicles, for example.
Yeah. I love that. We need the top-down change and bottom-up together.
Yes. And that sort of idea that it's one or the other is really a false. It can't ever happen with only one side of that polarity. So the question is sort of how they interact. I mean, you're not going to get there only with consumer behavior. You absolutely have to have the big structural change coming from the state, the government. But the consumer behavior also becomes an important part of it. And I would say the final thing is just what's happening with COVID. The fact that people are now living in a world in which they're really pretty much down in many cases to the basics, food and shelter, medicine, and for people who are not so economically stressed. So if you are a person who's still getting a paycheck and you have a reasonable place to shelter in place, these are the kinds of people who you're hearing things like, oh, I'm getting to spend more time with my children. I'm learning more about what really matters to me and so forth. So some of that messaging that's come out of the, anti-consumer movement or the sort of sustainable consumption, or what we used to call it in my organization, the conscious consumption movement. Many of those lessons people are actually experiencing in their daily lives now. And I think that that also, presents us with some possibilities going forward.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you, Julia. We at EcoResolution, a big mission behind what we do is about trying to kind of inspire that, the individual spark within you to start to take action, but definitely within the context of what we need is systemic change. That, whatever you do within just, yourself is kind of gives us the motivation to ask for the change from the top down. But yeah, it's definitely needed from our governments and institutions first.
Yeah. Can I just add one thing about in terms of the work you're doing? I co-founded a group called the Center for a New American Dream back in the 1990s, and we were focusing on all these issues that you and I have been talking about. And one of the things we really felt strongly about was our message is not one of people needing to sacrifice for the planet. It really is about a better way to live. And that's where you started, which is, that we're living in a way that's making the planet sick and it's making us sick too. And I do think that, having that sort of positive view, and outlook about we used to have a tagline that was more of what really matters, and asking people, well, what do you really care about? What really matters to you? And how can you have more of it in your life? And inevitably people would talk about their relationships or having more time or, creativity or, more, connection with nature and so forth. And nobody said, I want more stuff. And well, of course, there's a small fraction of people who want more stuff, but these were generally people who were in that work and spend cycle. They were time stressed, more likely to be women than men, often with small children, but, looking for quality of life. And I think that the emerging movement that's been called a number of things, in my 2010 book, I called it the plenitude movement. That movement is sort of showing a way to live that's really grounded in people's values and respect for the earth and others. And so
no, I totally. We did an interview yesterday with someone called Lauren Singer, and we were speaking about just this, the importance of trying to live in alignment with your values as much as possible. And the work that my sister and I do with Advaya as well, our tagline is joyful revolution and radical regeneration. Not that we don't mean revolution like, tearing down anything, but just like the act of finding joy and happiness in the process of change making, knowing that the world is constantly changing. So you're either going to go with it and kind of you have the decision about which direction you go in, or you're going to fight it. And the sacrificial language around change making and having to give something up that is actually just going to be hurting our fellow brothers and sisters around the world and our future kids or current kids if you have them. It's just very unhelpful for our motivation and unity, and not necessary either. It's been such a pleasure to speak with you, Juliet. Thank you so much.
Same to you, and I look forward to engaging more in the future.